The snowy peaks surrounded the chalet like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. The frosty air drifted through the slightly open window, but the room was hot from the fire blazing in the hearth. Its crackling created the illusion of coziness, but inside me a storm raged. Eric sat across from me, his gaze lingering on me longer than decency allowed. He wore his usual sweater, but his calm demeanor was deceptive. Beneath that mask lay tension that only I could see. Our affair began after a typical family dinner at my mother's house. Back then, everything seemed so right. Mark held my hand and shared stories while I smiled, trying to be the picture of a perfect wife. But after dessert, I stepped outside into the garden for a breath of cool air. And that's when Eric approached me. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You look tired." Before I could answer, he took my hand. His touch was warm, and that brief moment changed everything. We kissed, awkward and passionate at once. That kiss stole my breath and made my heart pound as if I had plunged into an abyss. Now, months later, we sat across from each other in silence, and I vividly remembered every detail of that encounter. "How much longer are we going to pretend?" Eric's voice broke the silence, low and tense. I lowered my gaze, afraid to meet his eyes. We had gone too far already. "You know we can't," I whispered. He leaned in so close I could feel his breath. But before he could do anything, the wooden stairs creaked. "It's Mark," I exhaled, pulling away abruptly and smoothing my hair. Eric leaned back in his chair and gazed at the fire nonchalantly. His familiar smirk returned, but frustration flickered in his eyes. Mark entered the living room with a lazy stride and stopped, scanning us. "Not sleeping?" His voice was drowsy. "Just sitting?" I forced a smile. Mark nodded and walked past without asking further questions. His indifference stung more than any exposure could have. When the bedroom door closed behind him, Eric's gaze met mine again, full of unspoken pain. At that moment, I realized I was hopelessly trapped between fear and desire. The morning began with a thick fog blanketing the chalet. I stared out at the dense snow outside the window, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that wouldn't leave me alone. Eric was already outside, his silhouette visible near the garage as he prepared the skis. It seemed as though he was deliberately finding ways to be alone with me. His suggestion for a ski trip sounded casual, but I sensed an underlying motive. Mark waved dismissively, engrossed in his phone call, not bothering to object. We glided over the crisp snow as if trying to escape reality, but even surrounded by forests and mountains, I couldn't shake the tension. Eric moved with confidence, his breathing rhythmic, blending with the crunch of snow beneath our skis. When we had ventured far enough from the chalet, Eric stopped and turned to face me. His gaze was direct, almost searing. The silence between us was heavy with everything left unsaid. I took a step forward, but my foot slipped and I tumbled into the snow. Eric was beside me in an instant, gripping my hand firmly. His fingers lingered on mine longer than they should have. I felt his warmth seeping through even the thick fabric of my jacket, a brief but sharp spark of desire piercing through me. He pulled me to my feet, his hand still holding mine. It was a strange sensation, to feel both vulnerable and protected at the same time. My heart raced, though I wasn't sure if it was from the fall or his proximity. On the way back, I avoided his gaze, lost in thought. His silence spoke volumes. When we returned to the chalet, Mark was still engrossed in his work. He glanced at us briefly before returning to his laptop, as if we were just part of the background noise in his world. I climbed the stairs to our room, feeling the weight of unease tightening around my chest. Questions about what lay ahead consumed me, but one thing was clear. Eric and I were inching ever closer to a line that once crossed would shatter everything. Silence filled the room, as though everything around us had stilled. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a faint, warm glow on the wooden walls. I watched Mark as he shrugged on his coat and grabbed the flashlight from the shelf. "I'll be right back," he said briefly before stepping out the door. The creak of the door was swallowed by the frosty night. I was alone with Eric. At that moment, the space between us narrowed to just a few steps. The air seemed heavier, almost burning. He moved closer without a word. The flickering fire cast shadows on his face, making them seem alive. Every step he took echoed inside me, in rhythm with my heartbeat. His hand brushed my shoulder gently. The warmth seeped through my sweater and into my skin, spreading like a wave through my entire body. I didn't move, didn't meet his eyes, but I knew. He was closer than ever before. He leaned in, and I felt his breath against my cheek, hot and unrelenting. The moment teetered on the edge. Any attempt at self-control dissolved when his lips brushed against mine. This wasn't just a fleeting impulse. Fear and longing intertwined in that touch. A weakness overtook me, but his arm steadied me, holding me up, as though that kiss was both a confession and a plea. Then a sharp sound shattered everything. I pulled away so abruptly I nearly lost my balance. Eric remained still as if nothing had changed. In the doorway stood Mark, his hair tousled by the wind. He scanned the room and then looked at us. "The lock was jammed," he muttered, as if explaining his delay, before walking to the hearth to add more wood. I stood there, my hands clenched to hide the trembling. Eric's gaze brushed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to look up. The smell of freshly cooked food filled the chalet, reminding me of the times when Mark and I could spend evenings peacefully, as if the world outside didn't exist. He had set up dinner perfectly, lit candles, brought out our favorite wine, and covered the table with a crisp white cloth. The candle flames flickered, casting a soft glow on the bottle and glasses, as though illuminating something more profound than a simple meal. I sat across from Mark, but my thoughts were elsewhere. The growing chasm inside me widened with each passing second. His smile was warm, but instead of feeling close to him, I felt hollow. My heart pounded uneasily as my gaze briefly slid to Eric, who sat at a nearby table, maintaining an air of detachment. His composure seemed unbreakable, but I knew he felt the same tension I did. Mark raised his glass, leaned in slightly, and made a toast. To us, to trust and honesty, without which nothing real can be built. It felt as if someone had pressed down on my chest. His words were so disarming that I barely managed to hold on to my glass. Bitterness slid down my throat with the sip of wine. I forced a smile, pretending to share his desire to rebuild what was broken. I heard his voice, his plans for the future, but they felt distant, as though coming from far away. His warmth no longer reached me. It only emphasized my detachment. In the bedroom, Mark held me, as if trying to erase the invisible wall between us. His hands traced my back. His lips searched for a response, but my body resisted, coming alive only with memories of what I felt near Eric. Every movement felt mechanical. Even his touch reminded me of what I desperately lacked. I felt guilty, but that guilt only fed a stronger craving, the craving for what was forbidden. Thoughts of Eric surged through me with renewed force. His gaze, his lips, the thrill of secrecy. I imagined it was his hands holding me so tightly. When Mark fell asleep, I stared at the ceiling, trying to breathe steadily, but the emptiness filled every corner of my soul. The night enveloped the chalet in a heavy shroud of silence. Muffled footsteps echoed in the hallway. I knew it was Eric. A soft knock on the bedroom door followed. Mark was already asleep, his breathing steady, while I sat on the edge of the bed, unable to find rest. When I cautiously opened the door, Eric stood so close I could feel the cold air from his skin mixing with the warmth of my breath. He leaned in and whispered, "We need to talk." I nodded, though I knew this conversation would be harder than anything that had happened before. We walked to the kitchen, dimly lit by the small lamp above the sink. The floor creaked softly as Eric stopped in front of me. "I can't take this anymore," he said, his voice quiet but trembling with tension. "We're hiding like thieves. This isn't a life, Clara." My heart pounded as I looked into his face. His eyes held everything: pain, anger, desperation. He stepped closer and cupped my face in his hands as if afraid I would disappear. I felt his breath just before his lips pressed against mine. This kiss was filled with resolve and despair. It was proof that the feelings we tried to suppress had only grown stronger with every stolen moment. I surrendered to that sensation for several endless seconds before I pulled away as if burned. His hands fell away, but he continued to look at me, waiting for an answer. "Eric," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't destroy everything. Not now." His face twisted with bitterness, but he said nothing. His eyes spoke for him. Slowly he nodded, as if accepting that I needed time, but there was so much pain in that nod that it made my heart ache. Eric stepped back and turned away. The silence between us was heavy and oppressive. When he left, the door closed almost noiselessly behind him, yet that sound still cut through the air, leaving me alone in the void. I stood there trying to gather my thoughts, but they shattered against my own confusion. I thought I had made the right choice, trying to hold on to my family. But why did every decision bring so much pain? The morning arrived with the creak of floorboards and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Mark, surprisingly cheerful, suggested a trip to the city for some shopping. He seemed eager to brighten our stay with something ordinary and family-oriented. I simply nodded, afraid my voice would betray my doubts and turmoil. Eric stepped onto the porch, holding a thermos of coffee, and leaned against the railing. He looked calm, but I could sense the tension in his every move. His gaze, as always, sent that familiar heat coursing through me, making it hard to breathe. We drove along the narrow, snow-covered road surrounded by white fields and pine forests. Mark spoke about evening plans, his voice steady and calm, but I barely listened. My thoughts tangled, returning to the events of the night before. When we arrived in the city, the bustle of people on the street distracted me slightly. The shop windows were decorated with endless strings of lights, creating the illusion of a celebration. Inside the store, it was warm and crowded. Mark and I split up in different directions, and I drifted toward the shelves with books and greeting cards. Eric appeared beside me suddenly, too close for me to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. My gaze caught the movement of his hand as he brushed mine. The touch was almost imperceptible, but a jolt of electricity shot through my entire body. I pulled my hand away quickly as if burned, and glanced around sharply. Had anyone noticed? Eric pretended to browse the cards, but I knew. Every move of his was deliberate. He took half a step back and, without looking at me, slipped a small envelope between the books. I froze, feeling the paper against my fingers. My pulse pounded in my temples as I carefully unfolded it in a quiet corner. 2 simple words, written in his familiar handwriting. "You are mine." The world around me seemed to shrink. The hum of voices from other shoppers became a distant echo. Those 2 words filled every corner of my mind, pushing out all reason. I tucked the card into my coat pocket and returned to Mark, who was waving me over at the checkout impatiently. Eric stood slightly behind us, perfectly composed. No one would have guessed that just moments ago, he had shifted the course of my day with a single short phrase. On the drive back, I barely spoke, staring at the snow-covered trees and feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and sweet ache. The words, "You are mine," burned inside me, echoing with every heartbeat. When we returned to the chalet, I still felt his presence near me, even though he hadn't said another word. Night had swallowed the chalet, covering it with silence and a fresh layer of snow. The forest shadows grew darker under the pale moonlight. I stepped outside to be alone, even for a moment, but he was already there, standing near the trail, as if he knew I'd come. We walked in silence along the snow-covered path. The quiet crunch of snow underfoot seemed louder than the beating of my heart. Eric was the first to stop, his head tilting slightly as if debating something silently. His face was tense, his gaze heavy. He said nothing at first, but I knew why he was here. "All of this is pushing us to the edge," he said finally. A cold chill ran through me, though it wasn't from the wind. He was right. We had crossed the line long ago, yet still clung to a fragile balance. "Do you think this can be avoided?" My voice was quieter than I expected. He didn't answer. His eyes, piercing and unwavering, spoke louder than words. The contradiction inside me grew. Fear of losing my familiar life clashed with the desire to plunge into the unknown. We stood close enough that I could feel his breath. This wasn't just a moment. It was a dead end with no easy way out. At last, he looked away and took a step back. "You know what I want," he said quietly, then turned and walked back down the path. His footsteps faded into the night, leaving me standing alone, the emptiness around me growing thicker. When I returned to the chalet, it felt like I was carrying the weight of that conversation on my shoulders. Mark was still sitting by the fire, unaware I'd even left, but all I could feel was that I'd taken another step forward, deeper into a place where I could never remain the same. The air was filled with the scent of spices and red wine. When I came downstairs, I saw the table set: candles, wine glasses, a crisp white tablecloth. Mark stood by the stove, carefully pouring mulled wine into a carafe. Soft music played in the background, giving the evening a warmth that hadn't existed between us for a long time. I hesitated for a moment, feeling both confusion and a strange sense of anticipation. Mark noticed me and gestured for me to sit. His smile seemed genuine, but I knew that behind its simplicity, there was something deeper. I sat down, feeling tension spreading through my body. Mark sat across from me, and for a few moments, silence lingered, broken only by the faint crackle of the candle flame. He slowly filled my glass with wine, his movements precise, as if every motion had been carefully thought out. I averted my gaze, trying to focus on the music, but my heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out the melody. "You've changed," Mark said, his eyes steady. His voice was calm, but it pierced through me, revealing all my fears. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation, but it was enough to make me feel exposed. I took a sip of wine, hoping the heat of the drink would ease my confusion. The wine warmed my throat, but couldn't hide the truth. I knew he sensed the invisible wall between us. Mark began to talk about the future, about how we could take a trip together, return to the things that once made us happy. His voice was steady, restrained, as if he feared that every word could break the fragile balance that remained. I nodded as I listened, but his words echoed without meaning. My heart had long belonged to someone else, and every moment of this dinner reminded me how far I had drifted from who I used to be. He was reaching for something real, but I couldn't respond in kind. I saw how hard he was trying to make this evening special, to bring us back to the beginning, and that made the guilt even heavier. After the last sip of wine, I stood and told him I was tired. Mark nodded, not trying to stop me, but I saw a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He remained at the table, staring at the candles thoughtfully as I climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of each step. In the bedroom, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. A woman with empty eyes and slumped shoulders stared back at me, a stranger I barely recognized. I closed my eyes, trying to banish the feeling, but instead of emptiness, Eric's face appeared. His gaze was just as intense and scorching as I remembered. The forbidden desire, it was still alive inside me, quietly waiting for its moment to resurface. Mark shut the door behind him, and the sound of his departing footsteps dissolved into the winter air. I stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the snowy road. Everything inside me stilled as though the world was holding its breath. The silence was broken by footsteps on the stairs. Eric. He appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, resolute, as if he'd finally stopped holding back. His gaze burned through me. I felt the ground slip from under my feet as he stepped closer. His hand brushed my face, warm, firm, making me forget everything. In the next moment, I was in his arms. His lips pressed insistently against mine, and everything around us disappeared, as if there was no past or future, only this moment. I clung to him, feeling the tremor spread through my entire body. His arms held me so tightly it felt like he was trying to keep me from falling into an abyss. My heart pounded so loudly I couldn't hear anything but his breath and the wild beat of my pulse. We moved toward the bed, and I felt him gently lay me down, as if this moment was meant to last forever. Everything that had held me back crumbled in an instant. I melted into the warmth of his body, feeling touches that were painfully longed for. In that moment, there were no doubts or guilt, only the desperate desire to feel him with no boundaries, no rules. Every one of his movements was both fierce and tender. I closed my eyes, waves of pleasure crashing over me and overwhelming my senses. In that moment, I was no longer the woman clinging to the illusion of stability. I was a woman who had finally allowed herself to drown in her own feelings. But somewhere deep inside, I knew this moment was fragile, like ice on the surface of a frozen lake. We had ventured too far, and the way back might forever remain closed. The room was filled with the scent of his skin, mingling with the faint chill of winter air. Everything felt motionless, as if time itself had stopped, succumbing to this pulse of passion. The only sound was our breathing, intertwined as one. The sound of the engine tore through the silence, splitting the world into before and after. My heart clenched with dread. I saw Eric tense as if his body already knew that time had run out. The sound of the door opening and heavy footsteps echoed through the house. I could barely breathe, trying to regain even a shred of composure, but my body betrayed me. With trembling hands, I pulled on my robe. Eric moved toward the door but stopped. There was no way out. Mark climbed the stairs faster than I expected. His shadow filled the doorway, and then he appeared, frozen in place. His gaze swept across the room, disheveled sheets, clothes scattered on the floor. It was like a blow, slow and brutal. The silence pressed in from all sides. He didn't ask anything. There was no need. The moment stretched endlessly, while shock and anger solidified on his face. I felt something inside me break completely. Words weren't necessary. Everything was already clear. Mark took a step forward, his breathing heavy, as if each breath was cutting him from the inside. Something tightened in my chest so hard that I could barely speak, but the words still slipped from my lips. It's been a long time. The confession escaped like molten iron, scorching both of us. Mark didn't move, as if nailed to the spot. His face was expressionless. No rage, no pain, only a chilling emptiness. I couldn't look at him, but I couldn't look away either. All that remained was to brace for the devastating wave that was about to crash down completely. Mark froze for a few seconds, as if unable to believe what he'd seen. Then everything snapped. His fury was palpable, heavy, searing. The air itself seemed to tremble with tension. He took a step forward, his breathing ragged and uneven. I saw the pain in his eyes mixed with a rage that surged outward like a storm. His stare burned through me. I stood there as if on the edge of a cliff, feeling that this was the end of everything that had once seemed solid. Eric stepped forward instinctively, as though placing himself between us. His expression remained calm, but his eyes betrayed a readiness to defend. Mark stopped, his fists clenched. I could see how hard he was fighting not to let his despair take over, but his lips trembled nonetheless. The room became unbearably quiet. Eric didn't try to retreat. He stood firm, as if he wanted to show he wasn't ashamed of his feelings or what had happened. His silent defiance, his confidence, was almost painful to witness. Mark turned abruptly, as if trying not to shatter into pieces from his anger. His face was stripped of emotion. Only cold resolve remained. I knew everything had already been decided before he spoke. Eric took a step back as if he accepted it without resistance. But before leaving, he gave me one last look. His eyes were filled with promises and silent regret. Not for what had happened, but for how it had ended. When the door closed behind him, I listened as his footsteps faded into the snow outside. Mark stood by the window, his shoulders stiff. There was something final in his stillness. The last thread binding us had snapped. I clenched my hands to keep from collapsing. The room still smelled of spices and wine, but that warmth no longer mattered. I knew there was no going back. The silence in the chalet was suffocating. Even the walls seemed to have absorbed the weight of everything that had happened. I sat at the table with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. A letter felt like the only way to piece together everything tearing me apart and finally express my thoughts clearly and honestly. I stared at the empty page for a long time before picking up the pen. The words wouldn't come. They were stuck somewhere deep inside, turning into pain. But after taking a deep breath, I began to write. The lines formed slowly and uncertainly. I wrote about how I had tried to save our marriage, how I had become trapped between duty and my own emotions, about how my fear of losing my familiar life had pushed me to pretend nothing was happening. But the truth was merciless. I wrote that things had gone too far and that I couldn't undo anything. I wrote that I was pregnant, and that I didn't know who the father was, Mark or Eric. Those words burned more than I expected. My hand trembled and the ink smeared slightly on the paper. I reread my confession and the pain surged again like a wave. The letter was short, but it contained everything I had hidden for so long. Fear, doubt, love, and pain. I folded the page in half, placed it in an envelope, and left it on the table. I didn't have the strength to face Mark's reaction immediately, so I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The cold air stung my skin, but I needed that feeling of reality. The snow lay in a thick white blanket, and an eerie silence surrounded me. When I returned, Mark was already standing by the window holding my letter. I stopped at the doorway and watched as he read the last line. His face was frozen, devoid of emotion, only cold emptiness. He lifted his eyes and his gaze pierced through me. He crumpled the letter and dropped it to the floor. There was no outburst of anger, only devastating silence. Then he turned and began packing his things, still silent and focused. I watched as he folded his shirts and closed his suitcase, as if clinging to a routine to keep himself from falling apart. I stood motionless, feeling as though time had stopped. Everything that had tied us together was gone in that moment. This wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the end of my understanding of who we were. When the suitcase was zipped shut, Mark walked to the door. His movements were quick but not abrupt. He seemed determined to stay in control. He put on his coat, grabbed his keys, and paused at the door. His eyes met mine again, and this time they weren't empty. They held a cold clarity and inevitability. "It's not my child, and you know it," he said so quietly that it hurt more than a scream. He stepped outside and closed the door with a dull thud. I sank to my knees beside the crumpled letter, picking up the folded sheet. The ink had faded slightly from the creases, but the words remained as unbearable as ever. I unfolded it and read it again as if hoping to see something different, but each word stayed the same. My heart constricted tighter with every breath. The snow kept falling outside. The flakes softly covered the porch, erasing Mark's footsteps. I sat on the floor, feeling the cold slowly seep into my soul. Tears streamed down my face, but I barely noticed them. My life was falling apart, layer by layer. All that remained was emptiness, heavy, deep, and utterly silent. The chalet felt dead, as though life itself had left with Mark. Only the soft crackling of the dying fire broke the oppressive silence. I sat by the window staring at the white expanse outside, but even the sight of snowdrifts felt blurred, as though through a veil. I didn't know how much time had passed, seconds or hours. It all blurred into one. Footsteps at the door sounded unnervingly loud. I flinched, feeling a jolt in my chest. The door opened and Eric stood in the doorway. His face was somber, but his eyes glimmered with concern. He saw me and immediately stepped closer, as though afraid I would disappear if he hesitated even for a second. "You're not alone," he said, crouching in front of me and gently touching my hand. His touch was careful, as if I could shatter into pieces. Eric's words filled the emptiness inside me, though not enough to erase it entirely. I looked at him, but the pain still clouded my thoughts, keeping me from believing in the future. Eric glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the crumpled letter on the floor. He sighed, but didn't ask what had happened. He already knew. "You'll get through this," he said softly, as if reassuring both of us. "We'll get through this." I wanted to believe him, but fear broke through his words. "I'm scared, Eric," I whispered before I could stop myself. My voice trembled. "Everything is so tangled. What if I make another mistake? What if I ruin everything even more?" He didn't interrupt. He just held me tighter. His warmth spread through me as if trying to melt the cold void inside. "You're not alone," he repeated quietly. I closed my eyes, feeling his breath close to me. It wasn't just a gesture of comfort. It was a promise. He wasn't Mark. He wasn't a reminder of the past. He was my chance to start over. But I wasn't sure if I had the strength. "You're everything that matters to me," he whispered, his voice so soft it seemed to dissolve into the air. I squeezed his hand but said nothing. There was still emptiness inside me, but for a brief moment, a small warmth broke through. Eric was here, and despite everything, I felt alive. The morning was gray, and the sky outside the window looked like cold ash. I sat in the kitchen, wrapping my hands around a hot cup of tea, as if this small source of warmth could bring me balance. On the table in front of me lay the pregnancy test, 2 clear lines that had changed everything. I stared at it, my thoughts colliding between hope and fear. This should have been something joyful, but it felt overwhelming and terrifying. The future stretched out before me, distorted like a reflection in shattered glass. I ran my hand over my stomach, still struggling to believe that a new life had begun inside me. The answers I had searched for so long didn't appear. I didn't know where to go from here, but I knew the point of no return was behind me. My gaze drifted to the window. Beyond it lay silent, snow-covered hills bathed in pale morning light. Their whiteness reminded me of past moments, those brief flashes with Eric when everything felt simple and impossible at the same time. I remembered his smile, his quiet laughter, his hands that could warm me even on the coldest days. Memories flickered like scenes from an old film. Our first kiss. Stolen hours beneath the forest canopy. The day I realized he had become more than just a fleeting desire. But behind those warm images came memories of pain. The moment Mark read my letter. His eyes, the same eyes that once looked at me with love, turned into icy shards. The sound of his footsteps fading into the snow and the hollow silence left in his wake. Life had split at the seams. Everything familiar had fallen apart, the home, the family, and me. Yet here I was holding a cup of tea with a new beginning inside me. I understood that this path wouldn't be easy. I didn't know if I was ready to face everything the future would bring. But I knew one thing for certain. My life was now my own. No promises, no expectations from anyone else defined me anymore. I took a deep breath. Cool air filled my lungs, burning like the first sip of icy water after a long drought. My gaze returned to the window, to where the new day spread its pale light across the snow. The sun hadn't risen yet, but its presence could already be felt. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while I felt a spark inside me, weak but real. Now everything depended on me,